I knew something was wrong the moment my son asked about the bank accounts before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. My husband had been gone for less than 24 hours when Ethan stood in the doorway of the living room, holding his phone and speaking in the careful voice people use when they believe they are being practical. The house still smelled faintly of the lilies friends had delivered that morning, and the quiet after the hospital felt heavier than any silence I had known before. Robert and I had lived in that house for 46 years, long enough that every chair and every picture frame carried a memory of the life we built together. Yet while I was still trying to understand the shape of the empty space he left behind, Ethan was already asking questions about paperwork and accounts. Vanessa stood beside him with her arms folded and a look of polite concern that did not quite reach her eyes. She said it might be a good idea for us to start organizing things early so no one would feel overwhelmed later. I nodded slowly as if the suggestion made sense, but inside I felt a quiet distance growing between the moment I was living and the one they seemed ready to move toward. I told them the documents could wait until after the service because there was still so much to arrange. Ethan agreed quickly, but I noticed the way Vanessa glanced toward the hallway that led to Robert's study. The same room where my husband had spent countless evenings reviewing his investments and writing notes in the small leather notebook he always kept beside his desk. I had not stepped into that room since the night before he passed away. The memory of that evening returned to me with a clarity that surprised me. Robert had been sitting in his chair by the window with the lamp casting a soft circle of light across the desk. His voice was weaker than it had been a month earlier, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He told me there were things I should not say right away, even if people asked. He said grief changes people, but money reveals them. I had promised him I would listen carefully before I spoke about anything connected to the accounts he had built over the years. Standing in the living room that afternoon, I realized that promise had already begun to matter. Vanessa suggested we should probably check the insurance documents and maybe schedule a meeting with the family attorney within the week. Ethan said he would handle the phone calls if I wanted him to. Their voices were calm and reasonable, yet something about the timing felt too quick, as though the future had already replaced the present for them. I walked to the window and looked out across the backyard where Robert used to sit every morning with his coffee. The late afternoon sunlight was touching the top of the fence, and the quiet of the yard reminded me that the world outside our house had not changed at all. Inside, however, something subtle had shifted. I realized that the questions about accounts and documents were only the beginning, and for the first time since Robert had closed his eyes for the last time, I understood why he had asked me to remain silent about the things he had left behind. The house felt unusually quiet after Ethan and Vanessa left that afternoon, the kind of silence that settles slowly into the walls after a long and emotional day. I remained standing near the window long after their car disappeared down the street, watching the empty driveway where Robert used to park his old silver sedan every evening. The sunlight outside had begun to soften as late afternoon turned into early evening, and the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood continued exactly as it always had. A neighbor watered her garden across the street, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the ordinary sounds of life moved forward without hesitation. Inside the house, however, time seemed to pause between one breath and the next. I walked slowly through the hallway toward Robert's study, the room I had avoided since the night he passed away. The door was still slightly open, and the soft smell of wood and old paper greeted me the moment I stepped inside. Robert had always kept the room carefully organized. The desk faced the window overlooking the backyard, and the leather chair he loved was still pulled slightly away from the desk, as if he had only stepped out for a moment. I placed my hand gently on the back of that chair before sitting down. The desk drawer on the right side opened smoothly, exactly as it always had, and inside rested the small leather notebook Robert used for his private financial notes. I had seen him write in it many times over the years, though he rarely spoke about what the pages contained. When I opened it, the familiar neat handwriting filled the first page I saw, numbers and short comments written with the same careful attention he gave to everything in his life. The last entry had been written only a week before he died. My eyes moved slowly across the page as I read the words he had left there. He had written about patience and observation, about how money has a way of revealing the true character of people when they believe no one is watching. At the bottom of the page he had written a single sentence meant for me. He had written that silence can sometimes teach more than confrontation ever could. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back inside the drawer. Ethan's question earlier that day still echoed in my mind, the one about bank accounts and documents that had arrived far sooner than I expected. I did not blame him entirely. Grief confuses people and sometimes pushes them toward practical concerns they believe must be handled quickly. Yet the look Vanessa had given the hallway leading to Robert's study had not been about grief. It had been about curiosity and calculation. I stood from the desk and walked slowly back toward the living room where the afternoon light had begun to fade into the quiet blue of early evening. Robert had asked me to wait before saying anything about the accounts he had built over the years, and as I stood there listening to the distant hum of a passing car outside, I realized that keeping that promise might reveal far more about the people around me than any conversation ever could. The next morning the house felt different in a way that was subtle but impossible to ignore. Sunlight moved slowly through the kitchen window and spread across the wooden table where Robert and I had shared breakfast nearly every day for decades. I poured a cup of coffee and sat in the same chair I always used, listening to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood beginning another ordinary day. Cars passed occasionally on the street. Outside and somewhere nearby a lawn mower started up. Life continued as if nothing had changed, but inside the house the absence of Robert's steady presence made every room feel slightly unfamiliar. I was still sitting there when I heard Ethan's voice from the hallway. He and Vanessa had come by earlier than I expected. Ethan stepped into the kitchen first and greeted me with a careful smile that looked practiced rather than natural. Vanessa followed behind him carrying her phone and a small folder tucked under her arm. She said they thought it might be helpful to begin sorting through some of the paperwork before too much time passed. Ethan added that dealing with financial matters early would prevent confusion later. I nodded slowly and set my coffee cup down on the table. Their tones sounded polite and reasonable, but something about the timing still felt strangely rushed. Vanessa placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a few printed documents she had prepared the night before. She explained that she had made a list of accounts and insurance policies that might need to be reviewed. As she spoke, her eyes drifted occasionally toward the hallway leading to Robert's study. It was the same look I had noticed the day before, a quiet curiosity mixed with calculation. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from me, trying to keep his voice gentle as he asked whether Robert had left a master list of investments somewhere in the house. I told him that Robert kept most of his records organized in the study, but that I had not yet gone through them carefully. Vanessa leaned forward slightly and suggested that perhaps the three of us could take a quick look together. She said it might be easier if everyone understood what needed attention right away. I listened without interrupting, remembering Robert's last conversation with me in that very house. He had warned me that patience would reveal more than explanations ever could. As Ethan and Vanessa continued discussing paperwork and account statements, I noticed how naturally their conversation shifted toward practical concerns. The language of grief had slowly been replaced by the language of management and planning. I stood up quietly and walked to the window where the backyard garden was beginning to warm under the morning sun. Robert had planted those flowers years earlier, long before any of these conversations about documents and accounts had become part of our lives. Behind me, Ethan and Vanessa continued talking softly about which financial institutions Robert might have used and whether the family attorney should be contacted soon. I did not stop them. Instead, I listened carefully to the way their voices moved between concern and expectation. The silence I kept was not uncertainty. It was the promise I had made to Robert the night he told me that money does not change people. It simply reveals who they already are. The evening air along the coast had begun to cool as the sun slowly descended toward the horizon, painting the ocean with long bands of gold and deep orange that shimmered across the surface of the water. From the balcony, I could see small boats drifting quietly in the distance while the sound of the waves rolled steadily against the shoreline below. Eric and Rachel stood near the railing watching the sunset while I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the quiet rhythm of the ocean to settle my thoughts. Eventually, Eric turned toward me and smiled gently, offering his hand to help me stand so we could walk down to the restaurant together. The dining room was located on the lower level of the hotel, with tall glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and overlooked the wide beach beyond the property. As we were guided to our table, Rachel seemed unusually attentive, glancing around the elegant room with clear appreciation for the setting. She commented on how impressive the resort must have been when it first opened years ago, and wondered aloud how someone had the foresight to invest in a place like this long before the coastline had become popular with travelers. Eric laughed quietly and admitted that he had never thought much about those things before, but he agreed that it must have taken a great deal of confidence to recognize such an opportunity so early. Rachel's eyes shifted toward me again with that same thoughtful curiosity she had shown earlier in the afternoon. She asked whether Robert had visited the property often when he first became involved with it, and whether he had spoken about why he believed the location would succeed. I explained that Robert had visited several times during the early construction years, walking along the same stretch of beach where tourists now gathered every evening to watch the sunset. He used to say that a place like this would eventually become valuable not only because of the buildings, but because people would always search for peaceful views of the ocean after long seasons of work and worry. Rachel listened carefully, absorbing every detail as if the story itself carried more meaning than the simple explanation of an investment decision. When the waiter arrived with menus, the conversation paused briefly, though I noticed Rachel still watching me with quiet interest as she considered what to order. Eric eventually suggested a seafood dish that the hotel was known for, and Rachel agreed enthusiastically while describing how relaxing it felt to spend time somewhere so beautiful after the difficult events of the past week. I nodded and looked again toward the wide windows where the final light of the sunset had begun to fade into a calm blue evening sky. Inside the quiet dining room, the soft murmur of other conversations filled the space, while the steady movement of the ocean continued outside. As I listened to Eric and Rachel discussing plans for the next day, I realized that Rachel's growing interest in Robert's past decisions had not faded. In fact, it seemed to be sharpening with every story she heard, as though she sensed that something important connected all of those quiet choices Robert had made many years before. I remember looking across the table at Eric and Rachel that evening in the restaurant while the last glow of the sunset faded beyond the glass windows. The ocean outside had turned a deep calm blue, and the soft lights inside the dining room reflected gently across the polished tables. For a while our conversation moved toward ordinary things again. Eric spoke about the long drive they had taken earlier that morning along the coastline, and Rachel described a small market she had discovered near the harbor where local artists sold handmade jewelry and paintings of the sea. I listened quietly, appreciating the way Eric tried to keep the conversation relaxed even though Rachel's attention kept drifting back toward the stories I had told earlier about Robert's early investments. Eventually Rachel asked another question, though this time her voice sounded softer and more curious than before. She wondered whether Robert had ever imagined that one day those investments might grow into something truly extraordinary. I smiled slightly when she asked that because Robert used to say that the real purpose of investing was not to create a fortune, but to build security that could quietly support the people you loved. He believed that money should never become the center of a family's life, only a tool that allowed people to live with dignity and generosity. Rachel listened carefully to every word, though I could see that her mind was still trying to understand the full picture behind Robert's choices. Eric leaned back in his chair and nodded thoughtfully, remembering how his father used to explain things in that calm and patient way that made complicated ideas sound simple. He said that Robert had always believed character mattered far more than wealth. The waiter returned with our meals then, placing the dishes gently on the table while the quiet sound of ocean waves continued beyond the windows. As we began eating, the conversation slowly shifted again toward memories of Robert. Eric shared a story about the summer when Robert had taken him sailing for the first time along a similar stretch of coastline many years earlier. Rachel listened with interest, though her earlier curiosity about the investments had not completely disappeared. Instead, it seemed to settle quietly beneath the surface of her thoughts. After dinner, we stepped outside onto the hotel terrace, where the cool night air carried the scent of the ocean. Lights from nearby boats flickered across the dark water, while the distant sound of laughter drifted from guests walking along the beach. Standing there together in the soft evening breeze, I realized that Robert had once described moments like this as the perfect time to observe the true character of people. Not when they were aware of being tested, but when they believed the world around them was simply unfolding as an ordinary evening by the sea. Later that evening, the air along the coastline felt cooler and quieter as the night settled across the ocean, and the hotel terrace was filled with the soft glow of small lantern lights placed along the stone walkway that led toward the beach. Eric and Rachel walked beside me while we listened to the steady sound of waves rolling across the sand below the property. The conversation between them had grown calmer after dinner, though I could still sense that Rachel's curiosity about Robert's life and decisions had not completely faded. Eventually, we reached a wooden bench overlooking the water, and Eric suggested that we sit for a few minutes before returning to our rooms. From that spot, the entire horizon stretched wide and dark except for the distant lights of boats drifting slowly offshore. Rachel leaned forward slightly with her hands resting together while she watched the reflections across the water. After a moment, she spoke again about Robert, saying that she wished she had asked him more questions during the years when he was still healthy enough to travel and visit them. Eric nodded quietly and agreed that Robert had always been the kind of man who preferred listening rather than speaking about himself. I told them that Robert believed the best way to understand a person was not through the stories they told, but through the way they treated people in everyday situations. Rachel listened carefully and asked whether Robert had ever explained why he trusted certain investments even when others doubted them. I smiled gently at the memory because Robert often said that patience was the most valuable skill anyone could develop. He believed that opportunities appeared slowly and required calm observation rather than excitement or urgency. Eric leaned back against the bench and looked out across the dark water while considering that idea. He said that his father had always seemed unusually patient even during difficult moments. Rachel nodded and added that the more she heard about Robert's approach to life, the more she realized how much discipline must have guided his decisions. The quiet conversation continued for a while longer as the night breeze moved gently across the terrace. Eventually, we stood and began walking back toward the elevators inside the hotel. As we reached the entrance, Rachel paused for a moment and looked back toward the ocean again, as if reflecting on everything she had heard throughout the day. Eric placed his hand lightly on her shoulder and reminded her that Robert had always believed the future belonged to people who respected the lessons of the past. We stepped inside the hotel lobby where the soft lighting and calm atmosphere created a peaceful end to the evening. While the elevator carried us slowly upward toward our rooms, I could not help thinking about Robert's final request that I observe the family carefully before revealing everything he had left behind. The more time I spent watching Eric and Rachel during these quiet conversations, the clearer Robert's reasoning began to feel, because true character always revealed itself in the small moments when people believed nothing important was being decided. The next morning, the ocean looked completely different from the night before, brighter and more open under the rising sunlight that stretched across the water like a long golden path. Eric had already gone downstairs to pick up coffee from the small cafe inside the hotel lobby, while Rachel and I stood quietly on the balcony watching early guests walk along the beach. The air carried a gentle breeze that moved the curtains behind us and brought with it the calm scent of salt water. Rachel leaned lightly against the railing as she looked down toward the shoreline where families were beginning to gather for the day. For a moment, neither of us spoke, but I could sense that the thoughts she had been holding back during the past few days were still turning quietly in her mind. When Eric returned a few minutes later with 3 cups of coffee, he placed them on the small table beside the balcony chairs and joined us near the railing. The sunlight reflected across the ocean in wide shimmering patterns while the distant sound of waves rolled steadily toward the sand below. Eric mentioned that the hotel concierge had suggested a short boat tour that afternoon, explaining that the coastline looked especially beautiful from the water. Rachel nodded with polite interest, though her attention seemed divided between the view in front of her and the conversation she clearly wanted to continue from the night before. Eventually, she asked again about Robert's early years as an investor, wondering how someone with such quiet patience had managed to recognize opportunities long before others did. Eric smiled slightly when he heard that question and said that his father used to describe investing as a kind of listening. Robert believed that markets, businesses, and people were always speaking through small signals that most individuals ignored because they were too focused on immediate results. Rachel listened carefully to Eric's explanation while turning the warm coffee cup slowly between her hands. I added that Robert often said the most valuable decisions in life were the ones made calmly after long observation rather than excitement. Rachel's eyes lifted toward me with renewed curiosity, as if she suspected those lessons might connect to something more important than simple financial success. Eric took a sip of his coffee and looked out toward the horizon where the morning sun had now risen fully above the ocean. He said quietly that his father always believed patience revealed the truth about people just as clearly as it revealed the value of an investment. Rachel remained silent for a moment after hearing that, watching the waves move slowly toward the shore below. The thoughtful look on her face suggested that she was beginning to understand why Robert had been so deliberate about the way he explained his decisions during the later years of his life. As the breeze moved across the balcony again and the morning light continued spreading across the water, I realized that the quiet observations Robert once described were now unfolding exactly the way he had expected, revealing far more about the family than anyone might have noticed during ordinary conversations. The morning continued unfolding quietly after our conversation on the balcony, but the air between us had begun to change in a way that was difficult to describe. The ocean stretched wide beneath the bright sunlight, while the sound of waves moved steadily toward the shore, and yet I could feel the weight of Robert's final request resting more clearly in my thoughts than at any other moment during the trip. Eric finished his coffee and suggested that we take a walk along the beach before the afternoon boat tour began. Rachel agreed quickly, though her thoughtful expression showed that her curiosity about Robert's life and decisions had only grown stronger since our conversation earlier that morning. We made our way down through the hotel lobby and followed the wooden pathway that led directly onto the sand. The beach was peaceful at that hour, with only a few families walking along the water while seabirds moved slowly across the sky above the horizon. Eric walked beside Rachel while I followed slightly behind them, watching the way they spoke to one another as the waves rolled gently over the shoreline. Rachel eventually turned toward Eric and asked if he had ever truly realized how much his father had accomplished through those quiet years of investing. Eric smiled softly and said that his father had never measured success by numbers alone. Robert always believed that the true result of any investment was the life it helped support rather than the profit it produced. Rachel listened carefully to his answer while looking out across the wide stretch of ocean in front of us. After a moment, she asked whether Robert had left detailed records of those investments somewhere that the family could review one day. Eric hesitated slightly before responding, not because he wished to avoid the question, but because he clearly understood that the topic carried deeper meaning than Rachel realized. He said that his father had kept very organized records for many years, though Robert also believed that the right time to discuss such things would come naturally rather than through curiosity alone. Rachel nodded quietly at that explanation, though the thoughtful look in her eyes suggested that she sensed something important was still waiting to be revealed. As we continued walking along the shoreline, the wind moved gently across the sand, while the steady rhythm of the waves echoed Robert's familiar lesson about patience and observation. In that quiet moment, I realized that the time Robert had described in his letter was finally approaching. The family had spent several days together without knowing that every conversation and every small decision had been part of a larger lesson Robert hoped they would eventually understand. When we reached the end of the beach path, Eric paused and looked back toward the hotel balcony high above us. The sunlight reflected across the windows where we had shared our morning coffee only hours earlier. Standing there with the ocean stretching endlessly beside us, I knew that the next conversation we shared would finally reveal the truth Robert had trusted me to protect until the exact moment when his family was ready to hear it. Character 1. White American widow, age 72. Front-facing portrait. Gentle, dignified expression, wise, calm eyes. Wearing simple light blue cardigan and modest blouse. Natural aging skin texture, realistic lighting. Mature presence. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Realistic photograph style.